Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month in the United States, and we have a few guests on the show who've been organizing the AAPI community in every corner of society. With the success of Everything Everywhere All at Once, Asian American representation through culture, entertainment, and media is propelling the Asian communities to unprecedented visibility. Behind the scenes, Gold House is the powerhouse that convenes creators, investors, and communities to grow the voice and representation day by day. We're pleased to have the founder of Gold House, Chen, an incredibly dynamic speaker, entrepreneur, and community organizer on the show. Welcome, Ping.
Thank you for having me.
So congratulations on hosting one of the most talked about events in LA, Gold Gala, where you gather the most powerful Asian artists and business people in entertainment. It's almost like an Asian Oscars. So tell us what Gold House is and how you've been able to so successfully grow this powerful and fun community.
Oh, cheers. I appreciate you recognizing it as fun as well. We do try to be joyful. We are the leading cultural ecosystem that unites, invests in, and champions Asian Pacific creators and companies. We do this because, one, we think that there's incredible power within harnessing 5 billion people and their respective gifts. Second is we also know there's incredible power when we each invest in each other. And then third is we also think there's abundant opportunities both for our diaspora and other multicultural communities if we can get it out there at the highest levels. The reason we focus on both creators and companies is we think they're sort of the dual approach, dual essential approach to socioeconomic equity for ourselves and others. So on the socio side, we think we can reshape public opinion and how our community is treated through media, aka creators. And then on the economic side, we think that we can sustain that productive and positive influence by investing in companies, by hiring equitably, by promoting thoughtfully, and so forth. On the entertainment side in particular, since you asked about it, we have a five-prong approach that I can elaborate on in detail, but all of them, from research to consultation to investment in the next generation to marketing of projects to awards, are all devoted to ensure that our stories are authentically and affirmingly told.
It's fascinating because you're not just focused on sort of Asian Americans, but actually Asian communities. That's why
Correct.
you mentioned 5 billion is a
Correct.
huge number. And I wanted to understand how you connect sort of the content from Asia to actually the Asian American community. Because, if you talk about entertainment, I mean, it's still the US Hollywood is sort of the top of the world, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it comes from a very personal place. So I have the privilege of being a third culture kid because of my parents. So I grew up in both Asia and North America, specifically in Shanghai. And so I think when you grow up in sort of disparate sort of cultural places at a young age, you recognize not only how they're dissimilar, but I think more often how they're how they are more similar than they are different. Um,
Hmm.
so whether that's in content and how we sort of see the world and tell our stories, or it's in companies and our longer term ambitions there. And so I think that informs a lot of Gold House's efforts of trying to invest not only very specifically in respective communities and respective companies, but also being very thoughtful of how we can take them to a global scale. So I think that's where it comes from on a personal level. In terms of how we think about it at sort of Gold House writ large, I think one is there's just a principle shift. Asian Americans are very important. 22 million people have their own sort of respective experiences, but we also, of course, think that there's more power when we can actually bridge all of us together. And we also know that because of our multi-generational, multi sort of nation upbringing, that we are more similar than we are different. So I'll give you several examples.
Hmm.
Even though Asian Americans grow up, of course, on the North American continent, over 70% of us grow up in bilingual households. And you probably can guess what that second language is. It is always an Asian language. Second is there are still a lot of cultural heritages and underpinnings and traditions that we sort of sustain or retain here in the United States, whether
Hmm.
it's as tactical as taking your shoes off before you go inside, or the multi-generational households that we have that are a remnant of Confucianism and honoring our elders. So there's just a lot of consistency there that I think it's endemic to us, whether we know it or not. The
Mm-hmm.
third piece then becomes the question of, at a practical level, how do we translate content? How do we translate companies? Let me begin with companies, because that is actually a little bit easier. As we all know, all companies want to thrive and be able to sort of IPO and or have some semblance of an
Yeah.
exit. All investors want to make sure that we can invest in the next great unicorns. And so we're finding a lot of promise through our sort of venture and economic efforts, where we can invest in companies that look similar in different countries and or want to traverse the Pacific in productive ways to grow their bottom lines. On the content side, it's admittedly a little more challenging because there's just different cultural contexts. Said another way, aesthetically, narratively, and so forth, at face value, there are just not as many consistencies between what would resonate in certain, let's say, North American countries as there would Asian countries, and vice versa. That being said, we do think that there is some promise. And so Korea, of course, gets the most credit for
Yeah.
this. But the fact that K-pop streaming has increased by 56% between 2015 to the pandemic, and then increased by triple digits throughout the pandemic and continues, is one great indication. On the K-drama, as well as sort of the Korean cinema side through CG Entertainment and now increasingly Kakao, we're seeing great promise of their ability to tell very local, specific stories that then resonate globally.
Right.
One of the reasons we think this is the case, and director Bong Joon-ho quoted Martin Scorsese at the Oscars on this a couple of years ago, is when he said that the most personal is the most universal. Now, the
Mm.
reason we think this is instructive, even though it sounds very qualitative, is when you speak to a very, very specific narrative. So it's not just about class inequity, but it's about class inequity within a Korean family in sort
Mhm.
of, the size of a street, in sort of a basement. The reason that can go global is because you surpass sort of the superficial demographic underpinnings and you get to the more foundational human level of that
Mhm.
experience, which is every family just wants to thrive economically for themselves, right? I'm not implying that being Korean or being low income is unimportant or inessential to the story. In fact, it is extremely essential. But
Right.
because they start at that level, as opposed to ending at that level, you're able to get to the much more foundational human sort of experience that then resonates worldwide.
Yeah.
We're seeing that with a lot of other sort of Korean sort of sensibilities. So Squid Game is another one, which is entirely about class warfare as well. And so anyway, that's sort
Well,
of the
yeah,
long.
you kind of already touched on what I wanted to ask you, which
Oh,
is,
sorry.
the rising popularity of just K-pop and K-drama, which is also hugely popular in Asia and in Taiwan, of course. And in some way, we're pleased to see that Netflix just announced its investment of $2.5 billion over the next 4 years, just in various Korean content. And so, all the TV shows and films that you just mentioned, Squid Game, Parasite, and of course, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and then Beef, Chinese born Americans. It just seems like there's a growing number of Asia-centric TV and film. So clearly there's a business case. It's not just sort of a diversity cause, right? Like the
That's
business
right.
case is there.
That's exactly right. One of the I don't know if this is unpopular, but one of the very proud moments I think for our community is that we've moved from community excellence to industry excellence. So there was a day when we had to sort of celebrate the first all Asian cast in a film from a major studio. In the case of Crazy Rich Asians, the first non-English language film to win Best Picture at the Oscars that is
Right.
of Asian descent.
There.
So all those firsts are great for the community. I think are essential to the movement. But we're now, especially because of Everything Everywhere, which is not only the most lucrative A24 film in history, but the most awarded film of all time, are now at
Mhm.
a place where we are just the most creative, period.
Right.
And if you look back at our sort of creative history, as well as our commercial history, this actually is not new. It just, I think, is new for the mainstream awareness. So, for
Mhm.
instance, the most lucrative creative franchise in history is actually Pokemon, which was created by a Japanese team, of course, right? More popular, more lucrative than Star Wars, more lucrative, popular than the Wizarding World, more lucrative,
Wow.
popular than even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is the most
Yeah.
lucrative cinematic universe. If you look at companies, for instance, we've also led here, just to invoke another industry where we play. Asians are actually the least likely demographic to be promoted to management in traditional corporations, according to
Mhm.
Business Review. And Asian women actually are the least likely, both to penetrate the C-suite as well as to get into boards, according to McKinsey. And yet, if you look at the companies that have IPO'd in the last 2 years, 42% have an Asian co-founder. And then 41% of the Forbes Midas list this past year that was released 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago are also Asian. So even though we're the least likely to be promoted management, for some reason, we're actually the strongest at founding and funding companies, in addition to be among the strongest and most creative people. And so I think I'm really proud of sort of the shift that, again, is not new, but I think in mainstream awareness is. Now, the next question, of course, becomes, how did we get here? One is, to your point on the Netflix investment, the accessibility, both in price as well as availability of broadband, as well as distribution platforms, has absolutely accelerated this. And platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and so forth absolutely get principal credit for this. I think secondly is the acculturation to translation as well as localization, which, Wendy, are very different things, right? I think has also accelerated the adoption of this creative. One of my favorite stats, for instance, from YouTube was that 60% of an uploader's audience actually came outside of that uploader's country. So if I'm so if I'm in Taiwan uploading a video to the world, 60% of my viewership on average actually comes from outside of Taiwan.
Right.
And it demonstrates not only the accessibility of that broadband sort of distribution service, but really the increasing adoption over the past 13 years of just different sensibilities that we may not see on sort of linear formats. And then the final piece, to your point, is just economic model. Unfortunately, this is undergoing a great reconciliation with the WGA strike right now, that indicates the economic model is actually not viable.
Which is the writer's strike in Hollywood. Yeah.
That's right. And so we do need to do better there with transforming traditional models to new models. But I am encouraged that there are other places within technology where there is increasingly a viable economic sort of sustainable living. So the best example, once again, is music, which is often a progenitor here. Spotify revenue has finally become very meaningful over the past few years for musicians, both independent and established. And I'm encouraged that we're going to find analogous models within the sort of narrative space.
Yeah, you actually have said that, it's always been there. It's just now there's more mainstream awareness, right? Mainstream, obviously, the West or the US. And you grew up in Asia, so you must know that, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and even India, they all have very vibrant cultural industries. And so, you probably grew up, watching a lot of drama from Hong Kong, for example, or Japan or Korea. At least I did. So I think, what's changed is that, like you said, in addition to their own appeal within the Asia region, we're seeing much more sort of just distribution beyond borders, right? Like you said, because of the introduction of YouTube and other sort of internet tools. And so these are opportunities, but are you seeing challenges, for example, in this kind of a trend and content distribution?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, well, for every Squid Game, Everything Ever All Once, there are infinitesimally more projects that are not able to sort of launch, localize, and so forth worldwide. And that's for a variety of reasons. I think the sobering thought there is not every project needs to be globally resonant. It doesn't even need to be multi-nation resonant, excuse me. Sometimes just being able to resonate within one country is already more than enough. We see this with the booming Chinese film market, right? And so I think the
market has to be big enough, right? I mean,
yes, that's absolutely right. Yes, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. But that would be one is sort of how big does a project actually need to be? And then where it is big, is it, to your right point, is it big enough? I think the second challenge I think about is, and this is not specific to culture, this is specific to industry, is the economic model viable? And so the problem that we're seeing with the streaming platforms right now, as is they typically like to pay everything up front. Now, the two challenges that implicitly invokes is, one, a lot of the residual payments. So as in TV, when something was rebroadcast on another network, a lot of writers, actors, producers, and so forth would receive an additional payment known as a residual. That goes out the window with streaming platforms. What is the replacement for that would be question number one. The second challenge is franchises or creative franchises, meaning multiple media formats like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like Pokemon, like Star Wars, are the most lucrative creative properties. How do we enable more creators, particularly independent creators who are resource constrained, to produce those big franchises, not just have something more creatively liberating that's five sensory, but also something more sort of financially sustainable? So that would be the second question I have there. So that's the sort of, I think, larger second challenge. And then beyond that is specificity. So while everyone wants their, or I should say, while most creators want their creative to be seen at the highest levels by the most people, there also can be a compromise or a dilution in the cultural or creative specificity of it. And so the question, and we see this with the Asian American sort of film market, a lot of Asian Americans just want Asian American creative that is only for 22 million people, right?
Mm-hmm.
The question there is, what is the tension there between wanting to be globally resonant but wanting to tell a very specific story? And so I think that's the third challenge that we've seen. The final one that I'd say that is probably the candidly most important is the dearth of multicultural executives. This is prominent within C-suites all the way to boards. There are still too few multicultural C-suite executives and board directors who are actually greenlighting projects, who are signing checks. And then within those ranks too, there's an immense pressure for when a non-Caucasian person rises in those positions to over-index in diverse hiring and promotion. And the unfortunate reality is a lot of those people can only hire inclusively and so forth. So many. They can't reverse, in some cases, a century worth of systemic biases. Right. And so we need to continue nurturing our sort of executives there to ensure that we can just greenlight more projects in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, basically, we need more people who are in the position of decision making, which is also part of what you're doing, making it so powerful, which I really appreciate. The other, sort of elephant in the room we haven't talked about is, the last, I would say, decade or two, right? We saw a lot of Hollywood studios kind of collaborating with Chinese investments. There's just a lot of investment coming into Hollywood, but that's become kind of an issue, right? Especially because of the geopolitical tensions. So, but in the meantime, there are a lot of people who are still, growing sort of this appetite for Asia-centric content. So what do you think is going to happen in terms of the investment, the money side of things, as well as just between Asia and the US, right? How do we break down the boundaries and the borders to make sure the content can be shared and stories can be shared?
Yeah, I think I'll begin with the philosophical principle, and then I'll get to the practical three regions that all of our eyes are on, and all of our wallets are on, honestly, right now. At a philosophical level, I often bemoan that the majority of the world is run by a minority of people. And so, for instance, you look at our time zones, we're all based on GMT. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? The majority of our world is where you and I are from, right? And so I'm really excited by the opportunities where we can just recenter the cultural meccas of the world, not to be for and by Asians only, but just to be more equitable and recentered. So
adding a different perspective. Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly. And so the three regions we're most encouraged by or countries are Korea, India, and Southeast Asia right now, given a lot of the geopolitical tensions that you do. And I mean this from multiple perspectives. Number one is we're really encouraged by the intrinsic intra-country, agnostic of the West, power that these three areas are already sort of building. We know what Korea has done, and we've talked about that. India has created more than 50 unicorns in the last few years, 2 or 3 years, which is more than they ever have before. Apple, of course, just opened up their first official presence. Bollywood is the most prolific by content created creative industry in the world. I'm really, really encouraged and excited by what they're doing there. You also look at absolute numbers. They're about to eclipse China in terms of population, and their middle class will eclipse within the next 15 years. And so we're really excited about the promise there and are investing heavily. And then the final one is, of course, Southeast Asia. Indonesia is a country that we've been investing in for the past 7 years. Fourth biggest population in the world, most engaged audience on digital media per capita of any. My favorite fact is like Twitter's, for instance, most active city per capita. Goes Jakarta. TBD what's happened now, but TBD what's happened with Twitter writ large. But I'm really encouraged by that as well, because it's such a nice representation of the increasing third culture populace that I'm a part of, the 250 million people are a part of. And so those are the three reasons I think intra agnostic of us, already booming, investing in their creative economies, but also we're seeing large platforms like Netflix and others invest actively in as well.
Yeah. Well, it's great to know that, these exist because I think most people don't pay enough attention to those emerging markets, right? So I want to come back to why did you found Gold House? And what's the meaning behind the name Gold House? I see that you have the gold in your background as well.
There's a couple reasons. My dream since I was young was to be the next Walt Disney. So how do we incubate and invest in both content and companies that make dreams come true? The difference between me and Disney, outside of not being worth $200 billion yet, is we try.
Yet,
Yes,
yeah.
that's right. Yeah, we'll get there. But it's to focus on existential issues as well as utilities. So what I mean by that is on the creative side, we won't invest in a bear talking to a tree for honey. We will instead invest in a new Asian story that reimagines how strong Asian women can be, that also happens to be very creatively exciting, known as everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. On the company side, we won't invest in a lightsaber, as big of a Star Wars fan as I am. Instead, we'll invest in, let's say, a cookie that has a Blasian founder who happens to be a woman. And that cookie actually is free of all 9 principal allergies. So it's a delicious product with a multicultural founder that actually can be eaten by all children, right? And so that's the big difference. Gold House is one of my crown jewels. Gold House is conceptually sort of a new Walt Disney company, or Walt
Mm-hmm.
Disney World, I should say, except it's actually real. So imagine instead of going and paying $400 to a theme park, which I love, by the way, I do that all the time, you can come to this Gold House and we will give you the financing, the resources, and distribution for your content or company at a global scale, right? So it's sort of like a real Walt Disney World, right?
Yeah.
Now, why did we create this? There are 2 reasons. One is affirmation. The second is affliction. So affirmation, I don't think that you and I, or people who look like you and I, are victims or minorities. I know what our power is because I grew up with it,
Yep.
right? And so the question is, who is going to harness the world's majority, who in the United
Absolutely.
States is the
Yep.
fastest growing population, who
Right.
outconsumes everyone else,
Right.
who is a majority of multinational growth for companies
Right.
based in the US who are scaled to Asia, who is going to harness this power? And
Right.
I'm not trying to say we're all the same, but I do know where we are similar, right? And those places are more often than not.
Yep.
So that was one on the affirmation side. And as you know, there is no pan-Pacific bridge. There is no one who has bridged sort of our diaspora to world scale across ethnicities and across industries. The second is affliction. So as you know well, in the United States, over the past 3 years, we've had record high attacks against our community. Many of them are older, many of them are women,
Yeah.
many of them are low income. And so when you see your own sort of get attacked, the visceral natural reaction as a normal human being is to want to
Mm-hmm.
protect your own. And so anyway, so that's where Gold House came from. And then in terms of the name, other organizations and platforms and investment funds that look like us, they call themselves Asian, they call themselves Asian American. The reason we didn't do that is, one, it omits a lot of the rich ethnic diversity that we have. So the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, for instance, is 6% of the US Asian diaspora. It's less than 1% of the global diaspora, but it's still really important to us.
Right.
We want to make sure we are inclusive of them. Second is we also want to be younger and cooler. Dare I say, whenever you see something that looks like Asian American organization or it just feels like something our parents would have
I
created.
know that
And
you're right. You're exactly right. Yeah.
yeah, and it's just not fun. And so we wanted just something younger that was more cohesive. And then third is we also wanted to rebrand our community. One of the biggest stereotypes, according to our research about our diaspora, is that we're all cheap. And I kind of hate that because it belittles us, because we're not. We're really high
Yeah.
quality. Some of us have very expensive
Right.
taste.
Right.
Gold is something that is not only universally valued, but I think is also something universally aspirational.
Yeah.
It goes back to something my mother taught me when I was actually in 4th grade in Shanghai. And she said, the only 2 things that matter being are what you know and what it's worth, which is her way of saying, can you give things to the world in a really productive
Mm-hmm.
way? And the way that she told me I could get there was through good education in school and then also making it worth something, aka gold or money. And so that always stuck with me of how do we actually create more gold for people? And that's where sort of the gold part of Gold House came from. Final thing I'll say is the Asian diaspora, as you know, is very fractured. There's often a stereotype of companies like ours of only being East Asian or only being South Asian. I care about East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asians, West Asians. Everyone matters here because we are a part of the same
Yep.
mother and continent. And so gold, one could argue from a color perspective, brings all of us together.
Yep.
So that's the other sort of reason too.
Fascinating. I actually think you're one of truly most thoughtful people on earth, probably on, you know, how to bring this community together, but from the economic and business perspective, more than just, justice, and that's the right thing to do. So I'm curious, what would you say is your superpower? Do you think it has something to do with your upbringing because you spent time on both sides, and it's the combination of East and West? Like what made you look at things differently?
So as you know, we're both Asian, so I don't know that I can compliment myself. I think I have an allergic reaction to that, but I would say the two areas we've probably excelled are I think being third culture has forced me to see how we are more similar than we are different. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's not only a skill that was honed by growing up in multiple continents and seeing their rich power, but also even in my last job at YouTube, where we had to support what became 300 million creative artists worldwide, whether they're individuals in Bangalore who are musicians, all the way to big media companies known as Disney and Burbank. And I realized at a very young age when I was 22 that actually all these creative entities want the same exact things. They just may talk about them in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example. When a musician has an event, it's called a concert. When a comedian has an event, it's called a stand-up show. But they're both invariably the same thing. They both
Yeah.
involve event venues, concessions, tickets, audiences, lights, world tours. They just, again, talk about them a little bit
Mm-hmm.
differently. And so I think that level of upbringing, that level of industry insight translates over to what we've done with the Asian diaspora so far, and what we'll hopefully continue to do with our motherland counterparts and partners. Just to double click on what you said earlier about why we focused on the economic viability of our community as opposed to just justice, which is
Right.
also valid, but can't just be that. We actually learned from both Singapore and the UAE, where both of these countries, as you know, are only roughly 60 years old. So they're actually,
Yeah.
one could argue, too young to have,
And small,
and
small in
small
size. Yeah.
and tiny, right? Like, I mean, you
Yeah.
compare it to China, which is the biggest country in the world and
Yeah.
centuries, if not millennia old, really.
Right.
I mean, these are babies, right? And yet, Singapore and the UAE are now the economic powerhouses of the
Yes.
APAC continent and region. And it's because they focused on economics over the
Mm-hmm.
past 15 years. And so we use that as a really instructive sort of guiding post for us of how
Yeah.
can we just build gold together net new. So anyway, so I think that's one. How are we more similar than we are different? And everyone wants gold at some point conceptually.
Yeah.
Um, the second thing I would say is how do I say this? I'm probably annoyingly relentless. The reason we always get what we want for the
Mm-hmm.
community is because we never stop. And
Mm.
and I think that's really critical. I think we now at Goldhouse have 35 self-made billionaire members. It's several of the founders of the leading companies, Snap to Pinterest and so forth. And
Amazing.
yeah, and if you ask all of them, and I'm not trying to belittle their incredible work, but you ask all of them what was different between what they did and what someone who maybe exited with $100 million or didn't exit at all, what's the difference between them? The answer is they just didn't stop. They will
Mm.
all tell you they're more or less the same. In many cases, they're not the smartest people in the room. And this is from their mouths, not mine, right? But the difference between those who are great and good in the world is just those who are persistent. And so I think that is the other distinction. We just do not stop.
Well, so what are your next big ambitions other than being, the Walt Disney, but even maybe a modern version of that?
Yeah, I think specifically, Gold House at our Gold Gala just announced our phase two plan known as Gold Bridge. So there are three priorities here. Number
Mm.
one, cross industry bridging. So having creatives invest in companies, having companies include creativity more in their own sort of, sort of marketing or whatever have you. So that'd be number one. Second is cross cultural. I never
Mm.
want to build a world formed by Asians. I just want to harness our power because I think we
Yes,
are the most powerful
exactly.
population for everyone. Yeah. Like, so I mean, to pick on you, for instance, it is our responsibility to make sure that women are 50% of the C-suite and boards, period.
Right. Right.
Because we now have power and we have a responsibility to wield that power. So even at Gold House, for instance, 50% of the companies we've invested in since the beginning are women co-founded. 50% of
Wow.
my leadership,
Good
actually
for
more,
you.
is
Yeah.
women. And that's
Yeah.
it's an essential priority. We are not our parents. And so
Right.
that's the second priority of how do we wield our power for
Right.
women, for other minority groups. I'll give you one more example. We announced the Latino equivalent of Gold House at Gold Gal last week with several Latino
Oh,
leaders.
wow. Amazing. Yeah.
Because if our two communities get together, we will
I'm
now
surprised something hasn't existed. I mean,
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. And they're the biggest in the, as you know, the United States, they're the biggest
Yeah,
minority
it's
by
all
far.
Latinos. Yes.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. They're four times, nearly four times what our size, and have
Right.
never gotten together. But imagine if South America, if Asia, North America could collaborate in productive ways. Imagine what we could do for recentering meccas, for
Sure.
recentering economics, and so forth. So,
Right.
anyways, that's number two. And then third is cross-continental bridging. We will
Hmm.
launch an APAC within September during F1 week. Probably shouldn't have said that, but we are already actively partnering
That's
with
a news.
yeah,
Breaking
yeah,
news.
sorry, we should probably but we're actively partnering with several governments and sovereign families in a lot of the regions and countries that I alluded to earlier to co-invest and co-distribute content and companies across the Pacific.
Hmm.
So that's Gold House's sort of phase two. At the holding company level, I've been actively working on my creative franchise. It will hopefully be the new Star Wars or Wizarding World. The difference is outside of not being worth in the case of Pokemon, $100 billion, or in the case of Star
Yeah.
Wars, $40 billion yet. Outside of that, it's also very grounded. So it's a very real franchise. It centers on, or is led by Asians, I should say, in our sensibilities, but is not
Hmm.
specifically for Asians.
Hmm.
And,
Yep.
and the Gold House is obviously in it. It cross pollinates very nicely, but I hope for that to go out early next year. So those are the next two.
Amazing. Well, it's truly great to speak to you who has been able to think outside of the traditional box and be so successful. So thank you for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today. And we'll be watching you grow and go higher while bringing along the communities with you. So take care.
Thanks for having me.